has spoken to Old in the past and does a lot of talks around the desert. He focuses on military, aviation, and desert history, and he's currently teaching at Cal State San Bernardino.
Right.
And without further ado, let me turn it over to Sid.
Yeah, good morning. I think this is my sixth time presenting to this group. I think the first time was 9 or 10 years ago over at the Willows when I gave a talk on the military history of the Salton Sea, and several others since then. Just the top one. Yeah. Anyway, most people think that the attack on Pearl Harbor happened in the morning with an aerial attack on the fleet in Pearl Harbor, but actually a little after midnight on the 7th of December, 5 Midget submarines were launched offshore with the idea of penetrating Pearl Harbor and attacking capital ships there. So this discussion is about all 5. Most of the time when we talk about the Midget submarines, we concentrate on the 5th one, which was somewhat controversial, but the other 4 have pretty interesting histories too. So I'd like to talk about them for a little bit. Closer.
Yeah, it's a very directional mic. You got to talk right into it. There. See the little down button. Down button.
Just the up arrow?
Down button. Down.
Down. Oh, okay. So the Japanese started their Midget submarine program in 1932 and ended it at the end of the war with the Chiton, or human torpedo submarine. So we don't want to confuse the Chiton with the Midget submarine we're talking about today. So there are many Midget submarines were built, and there are a lot of different variations. You can see here, these were stockpiled by the Japanese in anticipation of the invasion of Japan, which never came. And they had an interesting job. They weren't going to go out and try to torpedo ships. They were going to try to torpedo the landing craft, which was the Japanese strategy at that point. So we talked about that. The submarines that were launched on Pearl Harbor were the Type A, the very first type. They were called it was called Operation Divine Turtle. Like I said, there are several different classifications. Type A was the first one. It had a code name, Ko Hyoteki, small target. And most of the Japanese Navy people who saw these craft thought they were target vessels. It was kept very secret. They had no idea, most Japanese had no idea these were actually manned submarines. They thought they were unmanned targets. So these things are identified. It gets really confusing when you read about these because they were identified a number of different ways. They really didn't have any hull numbers until after the war, but somebody went and gave them hull numbers, which nobody uses. More often, they're referred to by the submarine that launched them. So if you talk about Tau number 16, that means that I-16 launched that particular Midget sub. In one case, the sub is named after the pilot. And when we talk about it from our perspective, we talk about the U.S. Navy ships that sunk the submarines. So if I talk about the Ward Midget, I'm talking about the Midget that got sunk by the USS Ward, World War I class destroyer at Pearl Harbor. And then the Navy even came up with what they call an encounter number, which is the sequence that they actually encountered these submarines. So like I said, it gets real confusing. Launch sequence. So specifications, you can see for yourself, they weren't very fast, 23 knots, 19 submerged, and they couldn't submerge very deep. 100 feet was it. And the reason, because these things were made in 3 pieces with rubber gaskets between the pieces. So if you got below 100 feet, that gasket started leaking. And they had one electric motor. The downside was they had no way to recharge that motor. They had later submarines, Midget submarines, would have a recharging auxiliary motor, but the actual submarine had to return to the mothership to get recharged. So you can see that if they, the range, if they went at 6 knots, they were only good for 80 nautical miles. So these things didn't have much of a range, especially if you speeded them up. So here's a look at one. And here's the 3 pieces. This is after the war or during the war when one of the captured submarines was disassembled for inspection. The bow, center, and stern. It had counter-rotating props on the back, which caused some other interesting things. Here's a picture of the whole sub. And if you look here, hard to see, but it shows you the comparison of size between the midget submarine and a regular submarine. So these things were pretty doggone small.
Germans have little teeny submarines too?
Pardon me?
The Germans have little subs too?
Yeah, the British, Italians, the only ones that didn't was the US. And we had no idea this program was going on. It completely was underneath our intelligence radar. So these things were launched from I-class Japanese submarines. They were actually mounted on the deck, on the back of the ship. And problems. In order for the crew, the 2-man crew, to get in the submarine, they had to climb out of the hatch, which means that submarine had to, surface, climb out of the hatch of the submarine, climb up on the midget submarine and down into the hatch. They had a stability problem, rolling and pitching at periscope depth, which made it very hard to navigate. Trying to see out of that, trying to keep it at periscope depth and see where you're going, it was almost impossible when the thing was bobbing around. Trim and depth control, they had no bow planes and very small stern planes, so control was almost non-existent. And when you fired a torpedo, the thing would breach up out of the water. And like I said, their charging was an issue because they had to go back to the mothership to recharge the batteries. And these things had not 100, but very many small batteries, which tended to gas, which when you're cooped up in this little midget submarine with a bunch of gassing batteries and pretty foul air to start with, not really a pleasant job. And by the way, the heat in these things got really high. They had very poor ventilation. So here's a picture of one. I paid $40 for a $10 model to get this picture, but that's okay because that covered shipping from Japan. So, but I really like the picture. And then you'll notice here, the torpedo guards in a figure 8 configuration. These things were a real problem because they turned out that they were kind of flimsy. And when these things were bouncing off the reefs in Pearl Harbor, they got distorted and they would actually foul the path of the torpedo. So later on, when they use this midget submarine to attack Sidney Harbor in Australia, you'll see they use a completely different torpedo guard. They must have gotten some intelligence somewhere. But there was a lot of pictures going out when they captured these subs. But you can also see the way they're lashed to the deck. This was sort of an afterthought, and the commanding officers of these submarines weren't real happy about having these things, this cradle welded to the deck of their sub. So the Imperial Japanese Navy had a doctrine that they were going to try to lure the U.S. fleet towards Japan and pick it off as it made its way to Japan. And one of the jobs of picking off the fleet was the midget submarine. So originally, these midget submarines were going to be used for this purpose, not for what they end up being used for, which was attacking Pearl Harbor. So the original plan was for these submarines to sneak into Pearl Harbor, lay on the bottom until after the aerial attack, surface and finish off any capital ships that managed to survive. But, oh, by the way, the aviators were dead set against this mission. They said, these guys are going to give away our surprise. we're going to walk into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. We don't like this at all. And most people thought it had a very slim chance of working, which it did. But anyway, these submariners went to Yamamoto and said, we won in this fight. And he must have had a soft spot in his head for, the patriotism. So he agreed to it. And then they even changed the plan. They said, we don't want to sit on the bottom. We want to take part in the original attack. So he approved that under the conditions that they not risk losing the element of surprise, and they were not to consider this a suicide mission. This is at the beginning of the war. Kamikaze is not even a thought. So he wants these guys to come back alive, but they don't have any misgivings. They're pretty sure they're not going to come back. So they told him, don't force your way into the harbor. Don't, try to go through the submarine. Actually, they didn't have submarine nets across Pearl Harbor. They had torpedo nets. So the submarines couldn't sit outside of Pearl Harbor and shoot torpedoes into the harbor. They told them, whatever you do, don't try to go through those nets. Don't attack unless the fleet's in the harbor, and don't attack before the aerial attack. And the aviators were pretty astute, because this almost did give away the surprise. The only thing that kept it from it was the U.S. Navy wasn't really geared up to get the word out. We'll talk more about that later. So the Midget submarines were launched a little after midnight on December 7th. There were 5, and they're identified this way. The Ward Midget was sunk by the USS Ward, a destroyer. The Monaghan Midget was rammed and sunk by the USS Monaghan, a destroyer. One was found in 1960 in a lagoon in shallow water. The 4th one, I refer to it as a POW number 1 Midget, because the pilot, an ensign, passed out and was captured alive and became the first POW of World War II. So we call him POW number 1. And the 5th one, the controversial submarine, is referred to as a 3-piece midget because it was found in 3 pieces. So of the 5 midget submarines at Pearl Harbor, 2 are sunk by destroyers. One's washed ashore on the day after Pearl Harbor, and the pilot captured alive. One was found in 1960 in the, pardon me, I don't speak Hawaiian, Keihai Lagoon, which is right next to the Honolulu International Airport. And one is the subject of much controversy, which we'll talk about. So here's a picture of one of the submarines being recovered. And you see here, each of the 5 submarines that launched the Midget submarine was supposed to take a position and torpedo any ships that came out of Pearl Harbor. And notice this one right here. This is way over on the other side of the island. That's where the POW number 1 submarine washed ashore. So this guy was really lost. Oops, going backwards. So subs tried to sneak into Pearl Harbor. They were sighted in the defense zone. Everybody thinks that Pearl Harbor, all the sailors were drunk or hungover or in church or playing softball. But there was actually an active submarine defense activity going on. They had what was called the defensive zone outside Pearl Harbor, at the entrance of Pearl Harbor. And there was a standing order. If any submarine was sighted that was not into radio communication, they had blank slate to torpedo it. You didn't have to get permission. If that submarine wasn't in radio communication, they were allowed to fire on it. So they were actually at a pretty high level of awareness in searching for submarines, because the Navy thought the attack on Pearl Harbor would be by submarine, not by airplane. So one of the subs tries to follow a Navy ship into the harbor because the torpedo net had to be open to allow ships to enter. So the idea was, okay, we can't broach that net ourselves. We'll follow a Navy ship in. and it was fired by the U.S. Ward, rounds from a 4-inch gun. And that's what years later would be attributed the first kill to the USS Ward. And here's a picture of it. You can see the submarine off in the distance. And remember, this is a World War I submarine that was brought out of mothballs for World War II. The Ward was never given credit at the time for sinking the submarine. And the main reason, because the crew were all reservists from Minneapolis. And they said, oh, you bunch of reservists, there's no way they can hit a submarine at that distance. So they were given credit with the first shot, or the first firing of World War II. But for a long time, they weren't given credit for sinking the submarine. It was also a PBY that dropped depth charges on the submarine. So if you talk to PBY drivers, they'll tell you, oh yeah, we sunk the first ship of World War II. But it was probably the Ward that sunk it, but the PBY helped out. So it's found by HURL, which is a Hawaii Undersea Resource Laboratory, 1,400 feet of water. And they found a 4-inch hole in the sail, right where the sailor said it was on the USS Ward. So this confirmed that the Ward actually did sink the submarine. It was found 5 miles from the entrance to Pearl Harbor. It had both torpedoes still on board. Okay, so it never got in the fight. Here's a picture of the submersible that HURL used to find the Ward, and there's a picture of the Ward over there. It's a drawing. Here's the conning tower, and there's the 4-inch hole right where the sailor said it would be. Here's the crew that shot it, and there's the gun. When this ship was repurposed, they took the gun off and it ended up in the state capitol as a display. And you can go there today and look at it if you want.
Which state?
Pardon me?
Minnesota or Hawaii?
I'm sorry?
Which state capital?
Minneapolis. Minnesota, man. So next midget was the Monahan midget. It was also sighted in the harbor. It fired one torpedo at a Navy ship, but missed. It turned around, saw the Monahan coming after it, fired another torpedo at it, missed, and was rammed and sunk by the Monahan. Pardon me? What time?
6:30 was the board, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can look it up for you, but I don't retain stuff like that. Sorry. You can see where it was rammed. Did a pretty good job of messing it up. So the United States Navy raised it and quietly studied it in depth. They measured it, they checked the torpedoes, they studied it a lot because this was something they had no idea was that the Japanese Navy had. So it was a lot of intelligence work went into it. The bow section and the counter-rotating propellers were donated, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And it was buried in a landfill, actually a submarine dock. And years later, it was dug up and reburied again. And there was a myth about the crew was still in it, but that's not true. The remains were removed. So the next one was the Kihai. I guess that's, anybody speak Hawaiian here? Know how to pronounce that? Well, okay, whatever it is. So here's the lagoon right here. And there's the extension. This is the Honolulu National Airport, and there's an extension of the runway. And the submarine was found somewhere in this area in 1960 by Navy divers. So so the hatch was open, there was no bodies, and it appeared to have been extensively depth charged. It had 2 torpedoes on board, and the torpedoes were fouled into the tubes. They couldn't get them out. So they unbolted the bow. Remember, it's a 3-piece, towed it out to sea and dumped it in deep water. as a safety measure. The government of Japan, you remember it's 1960, so we're not enemies with Japan anymore. The government of Japan requested the submarine, which our government agreed to. So it was loaded onto a Japanese ship in Pearl Harbor and taken back to Japan. They mocked up a bow section because the bow section had been removed, and it's placed on the display at the Naval Academy. So you could go, if you happen to be anywhere around Hiroshima, you can go to the Naval Academy and actually see this submarine. Just remember that the bow is fake. So third submarine was PO number 1 sub. This one has a really interesting story. Right from the get-go, it had problems. It had the only navigation devices on it was a gyro compass. Excuse me. This submarine's gyro compass was defective before it even left its mothership. In fact, the captain of the mothership said to the pilot of the submarine, "You sure you want to do this?" And he said, "Yes." By the way, the crews were 1 junior officer and 1 senior enlisted man. And it's interesting because the more junior the officer, the more senior the enlisted man. This particular one had a butter bar ensign and a chief warrant officer for an enlisted man. So anyway, it's got a defective gyro compass. It bounces off the reefs. He gets lost. And like I said, he ends up way over here on the other side of, here's Pearl Harbor. The submarine ends way up over here. It starts gassing. The crew bails out. The chief petty officer, crew guy, dies in the surf. The pilot makes it to the shore and passes out. When he wakes up, there's a Hawaiian National Guard sergeant with a 1911 pointed at him, and he becomes the first prisoner of World War II. Here's a picture of the sub. It was actually pulled on shore by a tractor. There's a look at it. So there's a couple side stories here. One is the sub goes on a war bond tour. So they put the bow section and the counter rotating props off the Monahan Midget onto this one. They load it up on a truck and send it to Mare Island where it's cleaned up, and they cut observation holes in the side. And it's loaded on a truck and sent out on a tour of the United States. Here's a picture. I think this is probably a civilian worker at the Mare Island shipyard. Where you can see what a Rube Goldberg thing these things were. And here's a picture of the sub itself. I'm not sure, but I read somewhere that all this writing here was airbrushed in after the fact. That this thing was sent on a war bond tour. The kiddies could look at it for a quarter, and adults had to pay $1. And inside they had like a fierce-looking samurai mannequin. So anyway, it toured the United States, 2,000 cities and towns in 42 states. And it would pull in and people would pay their money. They'd look at it and go off to the next town. Now, I know it's hard to read, but if you look up here, it says Hotel Nimitz. So the end of the tour for this thing was in Fredericksburg, Texas, which was Nimitz's hometown. And to this day, the sub is on display at the Museum of the War in the Pacific in Fredericksburg, Texas. And if you ever haven't been to this museum, it's worth the 2-hour drive to go see it. It is one of the best museums, in my opinion, of World War II. And I originally thought that they had it up against this wall so you wouldn't see the viewing ports that were cut into it. But the last time I went there, I looked real carefully and I could tell they'd actually been patched in, welded over. So if you get real close and you look at it, you can see where they patched them in. And once again, you see the figure 8 torpedo guards, which were problematic. And here's the pilot, Kazuo Sakamaki. World POW #1. And he had an interesting story. He spent a lot of time in POW camps, and he wrote a book, I Attacked Pearl Harbor. And he tells a story, and it's actually pretty objective. When I first saw that, I thought this is just going to be a, a rah-rah, aren't I great book, but the guy was really objective. And he gets portrayed as sort of a bumbling idiot because he bounces off all these reefs and but he actually ends up being vice president for Toyota, in charge of their whole Brazilian operation. He got tired of the way he was treated in Japan. He moved to Brazil. So he must have had something on the ball if Toyota made him a vice president. And interestingly enough, the other crews that took part in were worshipped as hero gods. They were actually given an official designation as hero gods. They were all promoted 2 ranks posthumously, and this picture was circulated. But you notice Sakamaki's not there. The Japanese government actually told his parents that he died in combat, and his name was stricken from everything. So he ceased to exist. The 3-piece, that's so much for that sub. This is the controversial sub. It was found in 3 pieces in a debris field 3 miles out in deep water. It was discovered by the Hawaii Eye Undersea Research Laboratory. In 1992, they found the stern section. In 2000, they found the middle section. And in 2001, they stumbled on all 3 sections. And I think the reason is because their submersibles got better and better. Then they made 3 research dives. In 2009, they took a Japanese admiral who had actually taken part in the attack with them, and he looked at it and he says, "Yep, that's one of the subs that was launched on Pearl Harbor," and he identified it by the figure 8 torpedo guard, because, like I said, that configuration was only used in Pearl Harbor, was never used anywhere else. When you see the subs, it's obviously that it was cut, not unbolted, into 3 pieces. And so here's a sort of a drawing, and it apparently had been scuttled because there's a big piece missing right where the scuttling charge was. So it appears that it was scuttled by its crew. So there's 2 theories about the 5th sub, and my definition is the conventional theory and the alternative theory. The conventional theory said the submarine never made it into the harbor. It lurks around the entrance trying to find a ship to torpedo, and it's spotted and fired upon by the U.S. Navy. It fires 2 torpedoes at the USS St. Louis, and this is very controversial, and then is either submerged or sunk and scuttled by the crew. It was discovered near the harbor entrance, raised and cut into 3 pieces, and then moved to deeper water and dumped. Probably in the 1950s it was discovered. The alternative theory says that the sub did make it into Pearl Harbor, fired 2 torpedoes at Battleship Row. 1 hit a battleship, the other was a dud. Okay. It made it to the West Lock. This is the alternative theory. And I'll show you a picture of the West Lock in a second. It was abandoned and scuttled by the crew, and it was salvaged and dumped. The West Lock had a terrible disaster. They had a bunch of LSTs that were loaded with ordnance for the attack on Okinawa, and one of them caught fire and exploded, caught, I think, 5 or 6 more. So it was an awful disaster. And the alternative theory says that the remains of this sub were gathered up with the remains of those other ships that sunk and were taken out to sea and dumped. And the reason that says that is because they were found in a debris field where some of the objects from the West Lock disaster were also found. So that's the logic. So here's a picture of Pearl Harbor. here's the West Lock. Sub was found up here. So that sub had to come into Pearl Harbor, over to Ford Island, shot the 2 torpedoes, turned around, went back up all the way into West Lock, and then they scuttled it. If you think about the lack of navigation ability of the sub, that's saying quite a bit. Now, in all fairness, the pilot of that sub was probably the most qualified of the 5 pilots. So if anybody could have done that, it was him. Supporting the alternative theory is this picture that was taken by a Japanese observer in a Japanese airplane at Pearl Harbor. And the alternative theory says that that red arrow is pointing to a Midget submarine in Pearl Harbor. And here's another look at the same picture. They say that the rectangular object is a submarine. The rooster tails are what happened when the submarine fired its torpedoes and the counter-rotating propellers came up and then dropped. And then there's 2 torpedo tracks aimed at battleships. So a lot of people claim that this is part of advocacy analysis. You can read the definition to yourself. Supporting the alternative theory is the bigger boom theory. According to, I forget which battleship was on, a sailor said that he heard a much bigger explosion than the others. So the thinking is that the Midget submarines carried a bigger torpedo than the torpedo planes, and that louder boom was the bigger torpedo. But studies have shown that what you perceive as the loudness of the torpedo depended on where you were in the submarine. They've had instances where sailors didn't even hear the explosion at all, and then others have said it was real loud. So that you have to take with a grain of salt. The radio message. There was one radio message that, I forget the exact Japanese word, but it was 3 times success. Success, success, success. And the alternative theory says that was evidence that they actually fired on a battleship. And the Japanese press, not press, but the propaganda jumped on this. And they said, oh, our Midget submarine sunk a battleship. And this really ticked off the aviators because they pretty much knew exactly which battleships had been sunk by which planes, down to the guy that dropped the bomb. By the way, the bombs were armor-piercing artillery shells that had been converted for this type of work. The West Lock connection. So because the 3 pieces of the Midget submarine was found with remnants from the West Lock, that's how the alternative theories concludes that the submarine made it to the West Lock. But in that same debris field, there's all kinds of other stuff, including airplane parts, ceramic pottery, you name it. It's just a big underwater junkyard. The bigger torpedo. Okay, the alternative theory points to a report that was signed by Admiral Nimitz. So if Admiral Nimitz signed it, it must be true, right? It said a bigger torpedo was found, a bigger torpedo dud was found in Pearl Harbor. Well, okay. If anybody'd like to read a copy of the report, I have it right here. And what the report said is this torpedo was dropped by an airplane, which in itself doesn't make a lot of sense, but that it had a 1,000-pound warhead on it. And the torpedoes dropped by the Japanese aircraft was like 400 and something warhead. And the ones in the Midget submarines were 700 and something pounds. So if whoever did this report knew what they were talking about, and it really was a 1,000-pound warhead, explosive charge, then it couldn't have been Japanese because they're on the metric system. It's like 472 and something, odd numbers. And that's a report that Nimitz signed. So If the guy who saw the torpedo knew what he was doing, then it couldn't have been Japanese. If he didn't know what he was doing, then who knows what that torpedo was. Okay. Oh, here, I was looking for it. I had it here all the time. So the ones dropped by the torpedo planes, 452 pounds, submarine, 772 pounds. So supporting the conventional theory, by the way, it's a lot harder to prove something didn't happen than it is to prove something did happen. So supporting the conventional theory is the USS St. Louis reports, the Vanderbilt discovery, and I never can pronounce this guy's name right, but a theory is that the simplest solution is probably the best. Okay. The captain of the USS St. Louis, a destroyer, reported that a midget sub was sighted and fired upon, and that 2 torpedoes were fired at his ship. Okay, little math. There were 5 submarines, 2 torpedoes each, total of 10 submarines. The Monahan fired 2. The Lagoon Midget, 2 were found on board. The Ward Midget, 2 were found on board. The POW Midget, 2 were found on board. The 3-piece Midget fired 2 at the USS St. Louis. That adds up to 10. That accounts for all the torpedoes. Here's the captain of the USS St. Louis, Captain George Rood. He's a graduate of the Annapolis. He made captain in a peacetime Navy, and he retired as an admiral. He signed 2 official reports saying that he was fired, that 2 torpedoes were fired at him. People tried to dispute this, and he said to their face, "I know what I saw." And then he also referred to a dark object that was sighted behind the ship. Later, when he saw the midget submarine, he said, "That's what I saw." So I tend to go with Captain Rood. In 1951, George Vanderbilt III actually found the 3-piece midget submarine off of Pearl Harbor. And he was actually had served in the Navy during World War II and led a series of expeditions, marine type expeditions. This particular one, he was in Pearl Harbor, maybe not him personally, but his ship was in Pearl Harbor looking for classifying sea life. He tells the Navy, and so the Commander-in-Chief Pacific orders it destroyed and dumped. Why? I don't know. Captain Pineau writes a letter to Life magazine in 1956 because Life magazine is doing a series of articles on submarines, and he said this happened. Okay. And since then, the controversy rages on. This book was written by members of the Hurl crew. It's a beautiful book, beautiful pictures, beautiful illustrations. And he mentions this letter that this captain wrote to Life magazine. So I sent an email to one of the authors, and lo and behold, he actually got back to me within an hour. And I asked him if there was any more information available about that letter. And he said, "I'm very frustrated. I went to the Navy intelligence. He said they confirmed that the letter was written. They gave me an oral summary of it, but they wouldn't let me have a copy of it." And I didn't get permission from that gentleman to use his name, so I'm not going to. But like I mentioned, he was one of the authors of this book, and all these guys are well-known marine archaeologists. They're top of their, yes.
Can you speak the title out loud?
The Lost Submarines of Pearl Harbor, the rediscovery and archaeology of Japan's top secret midget submarines of World War II, by James Delgado, Terry Kirby, Hans Van Tilburg, and some other people. Great book. Anyway, if anybody would like to see a copy of that email that he sent me, I have a copy with his name redacted because, like I said, I didn't get permission to use it. World War II first in Pearl Harbor, first shot fired by USS Ward, first ship sunk by the USS Ward, first prisoner of war, Mr. Sakamaki. And there's been several books. Advanced Force Pearl Harbor was written early on. And then this book that I just told you about. There's also one called Attack on Pearl Harbor, Strategy, Combat, Myths, and Deceptions. And the whole chapter 11 is titled The Fifth Midget Submarine, A Cautionary Tale. And he kind of explains why he doesn't believe the alternative theory. And there's lots of information on the internet. There's probably a dozen YouTube videos, but be careful because some of them are not accurate. Any questions? Yes, sir. I'm sorry? Yeah, they all were in combat. I don't know exactly what the disposition of them was, but they were, the I-class was a pretty common submarine. Bob?
Was there anything found on the two crew and Kihei Lagoon? Bodies weren't found, anything? Did they open a sub shop at Waikiki or?
No, they found a sword. They found some personal effects. They found a map of Pearl Harbor where it was supposed safe houses.
The two crew were never found, bodies.
There were the one that was dumped in the landfill. They had remains there. They took them. No. No, there were nothing found there, to my knowledge. Yes, sir. I have to get close to my hearing's no good. A man's torpedo?
Torpedo. Said those torpedoes.
Oh, at the end of the war, they had what they called the special attack mission, which was kamikazes. They came up with virtually a long lance torpedo that was stretched out, and they put a guy in it. He could steer it. It was a kamikaze. Any other questions? Thank you very much.